Staff Sergeant, my name is actually on the roster. If you could just... Holloway's face contorted with rage. You don't have a name. 36. You're a number. A quota. Another black girl the Army forced me to babysit. He stepped closer. Your kind doesn't belong here. Never did. Never will. Then his hand moved. The slap echoed like a gunshot. Diana's head snapped sideways. Blood appeared on her lip. 200 soldiers gasped. No one intervened. No one spoke. A young black woman stood bleeding, completely alone. But Holloway had just made the worst mistake of his 15-year career. 4 colonels were 3 minutes away. And when they asked him one simple question, what is her name, his answer would destroy everything. 72 hours earlier, Fort Marshall Army Training Center woke before the sun. Red Georgia clay clung to boots and uniforms like it had a mind of its own. The humidity wrapped around the base, thick and suffocating, the kind that soaked through fabric before breakfast and never truly let go. This was where civilians came to be stripped down and rebuilt, if they survived the process. At exactly 0500 hours, a white bus rolled through the main gate. 47 recruits stepped off, eyes wide, shoulders tense, duffel bags clutched like life rafts. Fear hung in the air, sharp and unmistakable. Most of them whispered, some prayed. A few already looked like they wanted to run. One recruit didn't do any of that. Diana Grace Foster stood still. She carried a single regulation bag, no jewelry, no makeup, no distractions. Her posture was calm, deliberate, almost too calm. Her eyes scanned the compound, noting distances, exits, ranks. She wasn't nervous, she was prepared. Her phone vibrated once inside her pocket. She didn't answer it. The contact name read, Dad. Diana silenced the call without hesitation. She had made a decision before boarding that bus. No favors, no names, no protection. Whatever happened here, she would endure it as just another recruit. If she failed, she would fail honestly. Inside the intake building, Corporal Denise Taylor processed recruits with practiced efficiency. She had seen every type, cocky, terrified, overconfident, broken. When Diana stepped forward, Taylor glanced at the file, then froze. Her fingers stopped moving. She looked at the name again, then the emergency contact, then the rank. Her breath caught. Every soldier in the Army knew that name. Diana saw the reaction instantly and gave a small, almost invisible shake of her head. Please. Don't. Corporal Taylor hesitated, then nodded. The file disappeared into the stack. Diana was assigned a bunk, like everyone else. Out on the drill yard, fog lifted as 4 rows of recruits snapped to attention, and from the mist emerged Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway, 6'2", scar across his eyebrow. 15 years of service, a reputation built on fear. His eyes swept the line. He was already choosing who would break. When he reached Diana, he didn't read the name. He barely looked at the roster. Recruit 36. Not her name, just a number. Diana didn't react, but Corporal Taylor felt her stomach sink, because she'd seen this before, and the recruits who became numbers rarely survived training. Holloway thought he had identified his weakest target. What he didn't know was that Recruit 36 was the one person on that yard who could end him, without ever raising her voice. By the end of the first day, every recruit at Fort Marshall understood one rule that wasn't written anywhere. Some people got names. Others got numbers. Staff Sergeant Holloway moved through training like a force of nature, loud, relentless, surgical in his cruelty. He barked names when it suited him. Reeves, Patterson, Delgado. Each name was sharp, specific, human. Then there was Diana. 36! No rank, no last name, just a number spat like an insult. At first, most recruits didn't notice. They were too busy fighting exhaustion, confusion, and fear. But by the second morning, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Every time Holloway addressed Diana, his tone changed, colder, sharper, personal. He singled her out for inspections that lasted twice as long. Her bunk was flipped, even when it was perfect. Her locker contents were measured down to the inch. Her uniform was scrutinized under the harsh Georgia sun until sweat soaked through the fabric. And every time, Holloway found nothing, because Diana was flawless. Obstacle course, fastest time in the entire cycle. Rifle qualification, expert, tight groupings that made the range instructor blink twice, written assessments, perfect scores. But what unsettled the others wasn't just how good she was, it was what she did after. When a shorter recruit struggled to clear the final wall, Diana went back. She braced herself, dug her boots into the clay, and pulled him over without a word. When someone fell out during a run, she adjusted her pace so they wouldn't be alone. She never asked for credit, she never complained, and that more than anything enraged Holloway. Because she wasn't breaking. On the third morning, before dawn, Holloway stopped the entire formation. 36! Step forward! 200 sets of eyes turned. Diana moved with precision, shoulders back, chin level. Holloway circled her slowly, boots crunching against gravel like a countdown. Your boots are a disgrace. They weren't. Everyone could see that. Staff Sergeant, Diana said evenly, they were shined to regulation this morning. The yard went dead silent. Did I ask you to speak? Holloway snapped. No, Staff Sergeant. Then why is your mouth moving? He leaned in close enough for her to smell stale coffee on his breath. You think you belong here? He hissed. You think scoring well makes you special? Diana said nothing. That calm, that refusal to react, lit something dark behind his eyes. I've seen your type before, he said quietly. You're here to fill a quota, and quotas don't last. Then he raised his voice. Drop. Give me 500. She dropped. Not a sound, not a pause. Push-up after push-up in red clay that stained her sleeves and palms. When she stood again, dirty but unbroken, Holloway's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected strength. He'd expected submission. Holloway thought humiliation would isolate her. What he didn't realize was that every time Diana stayed silent, more people were watching. By the fourth day, Holloway stopped pretending. The message was no longer subtle. It was deliberate. Lunch at Fort Marshall was supposed to be the one quiet moment recruits got. A brief pause where yelling stopped and calories mattered more than posture. Long metal tables filled the mess hall, shoulder to shoulder, trays clattering, exhaustion humming beneath low conversation. Diana entered with her platoon, collected her food, and scanned the room. Every table was full, except one. A single empty space at the far end. She took it without hesitation and sat down. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then recruit Tommy Reeves, short, broad-shouldered, still bruised from the obstacle course, picked up his tray and started walking toward her. Diana had helped him over the wall. Everyone knew it. He was halfway there when Holloway's voice cut through the mess hall like a blade. Reeves. The room froze. You feeling friendly today? Reeves stopped mid-step, tray shaking slightly in his hands. No, Staff Sergeant. You planning on sitting with 36? Silence pressed in from every direction. Holloway smiled. Holloway. Go ahead. Sit with her, and you can join her for extra PT tonight. 4 hours, starting at 2200. Reeves looked at Diana. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. Go. He turned away and found another seat without looking back. Diana ate alone. Every bite tasted like dust. From that moment on, it became policy, unofficial, unspoken, absolute. No one sat with 36, not because they hated her, because they were afraid. The isolation spread beyond the mess hall. Conversations stopped when she approached, eyes dropped, offers of help vanished. At night, when the barracks lights went out, whispers traveled from bunk to bunk, but never reached hers. She became invisible, and Holloway watched it happen with satisfaction. That night, long after lights out, the barracks door exploded open. 36! On your feet! Flashlight beams sliced through the darkness. Holloway tore apart her bunk with calculated fury, sheets flung, locker overturned, boots kicked aside. Then he found it. Her phone. Well, he said, holding it up. What do we have here? Staff Sergeant, Diana said steadily. Training hours haven't begun. Are you citing regulations now? He snapped. He pocketed the phone and leaned close. You really think rules protect you? She didn't answer, because she knew something he didn't. Every recording, every note, every detail she'd quietly documented, already backed up, already safe. Holloway walked out thinking he'd won. Diana lay back on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, alone in a room full of sleeping soldiers. And for the first time, the weight pressed hard against her chest. Not fear, resolve. Holloway believed isolation would erase her. What he didn't realize was that someone had already picked up the phone. Morning formation came before the sun. 200 recruits stood in rigid lines, sweat already forming beneath their collars as Georgia heat rose off the ground like steam. The air was heavy, charged, the kind that made every breath feel deliberate. Captain Bennett delivered routine announcements, training schedules, hydration warnings, reminders about discipline. Then Holloway stepped forward. The shift was immediate. Backs stiffened, spines straightened, fear settled in. "Before we dismiss," Holloway said, voice smooth with anticipation, "we need to address a discipline issue." His finger rose, pointed directly at Diana. 36, step forward." A ripple passed through the formation. Diana moved without hesitation. Each step echoed in the silence as she came to a stop in front of him, eyes forward, hands still. Holloway didn't bother looking at his clipboard. "This recruit," he announced, "has demonstrated repeated insubordination and failure to meet basic standards." A lie. Every single person standing there knew it. "She has violated regulations regarding personal electronics and displayed an attitude inconsistent with military service." Captain Bennett frowned. He leaned toward Holloway and asked quietly, "Sergeant, what's this recruit's name?" Holloway shrugged. "Does it matter, sir?" Something tightened in the captain's expression, but he said nothing. The chain of command held, for now. Holloway turned back to Diana, voice rising so everyone could hear. "Some people don't belong here. They come in as numbers. They leave as nothing, and nobody remembers them." He smiled. "Isn't that right, 36? The blood roared in Diana's ears. She could have ended it, could have spoken one name and watched the ground disappear beneath him. Instead, she chose something harder. "Staff Sergeant," she said clearly, calmly. "You've never asked my name." A sharp intake of breath moved through the ranks. "If you had," she continued, "you'd know I've met every standard, followed every regulation, accepted every extra duty without complaint." Holloway's smile faltered. "I respectfully request," Diana said, "that any concerns be documented through proper channels, including equal treatment regulations." Silence fell like a weight. "You can start," she finished, "by learning my name." Holloway's face flushed red. "Your name?" he barked. "You think I care about your name? You're a number, a quota, that's all." "I'm not a nobody," Diana said quietly. Holloway stepped closer. "Then who are you?" For a split second, the entire base seemed to hold its breath. Diana met his eyes. "I'm a soldier." He laughed, bitter, cruel. "Soldiers have names." Then his hand moved. The slap hadn't happened yet, but everyone felt it coming. The slap landed with a sound no one would ever forget, sharp, flat, final. It echoed across the drill yard like a gunshot. Diana's head snapped to the side. For half a second the world tilted. A metallic taste filled her mouth. She brought her hand up instinctively and felt it, warm, wet, blood. 200 soldiers inhaled at once. Then, nothing. No one moved, no one spoke, no one stepped forward. Holloway stood frozen, his hand still raised, as if his body hadn't yet caught up with what he'd done. Rage flickered across his face. Then something else, a crack, a sliver of uncertainty. Diana didn't fall. She straightened slowly, wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand, and looked at the red smear on her skin. Her expression didn't change, no tears, no shaking, just control. Somewhere in the formation, someone swallowed hard. Another recruit clenched their fists. Fear wrapped itself tighter around the group. Not fear of Diana, but fear of what this moment meant. Captain Bennett stepped forward at last. "Sergeant Holloway!" Holloway cut him off without turning. "Stay out of this, sir!" That was the second line he crossed. Diana turned her head slightly and caught sight of Corporal Denise Taylor standing near the edge of the yard. Their eyes met. Taylor was already reaching for her phone, Holloway noticed too late. "What do you think you're doing?" he barked. Taylor didn't answer. Diana spoke for the first time since the strike. "I have nothing to say to you," she said calmly. "Not anymore." She turned away from him, not in defiance, not in fear, but with certainty. Holloway felt it then. That shift, the moment when power starts leaking out of a room. In the distance, engines roared, low, fast, unmistakable. Black SUVs tore through the front gate without slowing, tires biting into gravel. They didn't stop at checkpoints. They didn't wait for permission. They came straight for the drill yard. Holloway's face drained of color. "What is this?" he muttered. The vehicle skidded to a halt, doors opened in perfect synchronization. 4 colonels stepped out. Their uniforms were immaculate, their expressions carved from stone. Inspector General, Post Commander, Judge Advocate, equal opportunity. In military terms, this wasn't a visit. It was an execution. Colonel Patricia Vance walked past Holloway without acknowledging him, her eyes fixed on Diana. "Private," she said evenly. "Are you injured?" "Minor laceration, ma'am," Diana replied. "I'm functional." Only then did Vance turn. Her gaze locked onto Holloway like a vice. "Staff Sergeant," she said, "I'm going to ask you one question." The entire yard went silent. "Before we continue," Vance said slowly, "tell me—" She paused. "What is her name?" Holloway had trained hundreds of recruits, but when asked for one simple name, he realized he didn't know it. The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. "What is her name?" 200 recruits stared straight ahead, afraid to blink. 4 colonels waited, unmoving. Diana stood with blood drying at the corner of her mouth, hands at her sides, posture perfect. Holloway swallowed. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. She's recruit 36, Mom," he said finally. "3rd row, 6th position." Colonel Vance's expression didn't change. "That is not what I asked." She stepped closer, her voice calm but sharpened to a razor's edge. "I did not ask for her position. I did not ask for her number. I asked for her name." Holloway's hands began to shake. "Ma'am, I use numbers as a training method," he said quickly. "It's motivational. I've done it for years." Colonel Morrison stepped forward. "For years," he repeated. "Interesting." He turned to the formation. "Recruit Reeves, step out!" Reeves jolted, then obeyed. "Did Staff Sergeant Holloway ever call you by a number?" "No, sir," Reeves said. "He always used my name." Another recruit was called, then another. Each answer was the same. Names, always names. Colonel Vance turned back to Holloway. "So let's be clear," she said. "You knew their names. You chose not to learn hers." Holloway's face glistened with sweat. I didn't think it mattered." "That," Vance said coldly, "is the problem." She gestured to Colonel Morrison, who opened a folder. "Recruit 36, he read aloud, "is Private Diana Grace Foster." The name rippled through the yard, but Holloway barely reacted. It meant nothing to him. Yet. "Graduated with honors," Morrison continued. "Highest entrance scores in her class. No disciplinary record, no prior violations." Holloway stared, confused. Then Morrison turned the page. "Emergency contact, Raymond J. Foster, Sr." Holloway frowned. The name stirred something. "Rank," Morrison said, his voice firm. "4-star General, Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Army." The world tilted. Holloway's knees buckled. He caught himself just in time, breath coming shallow and fast. "She's his?" he whispered. Colonel Vance nodded once. "Yes." Holloway looked at Diana, desperation flooding his face. "Why didn't you tell me?" he croaked. Diana met his eyes calmly. "You never asked." The words hit harder than the slap. Holloway thought knowing her last name would save him. What he didn't realize was that it was only the beginning of his reckoning. The drill yard didn't feel like a training ground anymore. It felt like a courtroom. 200 recruits stood frozen, witnesses to a reckoning none of them had expected to see. The Georgia sun climbed higher, but no one felt its warmth. Every eye kept drifting back to Diana, still standing straight, still bleeding, still calm. Holloway couldn't stop staring at her. You could have told me, he said, his voice barely holding together. You could have ended this. Diana didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. If I had told you, she said evenly, you would have treated me differently. Holloway opened his mouth to deny it, then stopped, because everyone knew it was true. And the next recruit, Diana continued, the one without a powerful name, without connections, she would have taken everything you saved for me. Colonel Vance watched closely. This isn't about who my father is, Diana said, turning slightly so the formation could hear. It's about what you do when you think no one is watching. Holloway's shoulders sagged. I made a mistake, he whispered. Diana shook her head once. No, you made a choice. That distinction landed hard. Colonel Morrison closed his folder. Staff Sergeant Holloway, he said, you are hereby relieved of duty, effective immediately pending investigation. 2 military police officers stepped forward. Holloway's eyes darted around the yard, searching for sympathy, for support. He found none. As the MPs took position at his sides, Holloway turned back to Diana one last time. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't know who you were. Diana met his gaze, steady and unflinching. My name was on your roster every day, she said. You just didn't think I was worth reading. The MPs led him away. No shouting, no resistance, just the sound of boots on gravel. Captain Bennett called the formation to attention, his voice tight. But something had changed. Fear no longer ruled the yard. Respect did. Colonel Vance stepped forward again. Private Foster, she said, this investigation will move forward with or without your father's involvement. Do you wish to file a formal complaint? Diana didn't hesitate. Yes, ma'am. For myself, and for those who came before me. A murmur rippled through the ranks. Names mattered now. Holloway was gone, but the damage he left behind wasn't, and Diana wasn't finished yet. The investigation didn't begin quietly. It couldn't. By noon, Fort Marshall was sealed tighter than a vault. Training schedules were suspended. Drill sergeants were pulled aside for questioning. Administrative offices filled with uniforms that outranked everyone in the building. And at the center of it all sat a single question. How long had this been happening? Colonel Richardson from the Judge Advocate's office led the review. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She asked careful questions and waited for answers that never quite came clean. Training logs were pulled. Security footage reviewed. Personnel files reopened. And a pattern began to emerge. Holloway had trained dozens of cycles over the years. On paper, his numbers looked solid. Acceptable washout rates, strong physical performance averages, no formal complaints sustained. But when investigators started reading how he wrote about recruits, something stood out. Some names appeared repeatedly. Others never appeared at all. In Holloway's handwritten notes, several recruits were referenced only by numbers, no surnames, no first names, just positions, tallies. Comments like lacks discipline or not mentally suited, vague enough to justify dismissal, specific enough to ruin careers. Colonel Morrison lined the files up side by side. The recruits written about by name, mostly white. Some struggled, some failed. But their records included context, effort, attempts to improve. The recruits written about as numbers, disproportionately black or Latino, no context, no second chances, just erasure. The investigators cross-referenced those numbers with attrition reports. 14 recruits had washed out under Holloway's supervision in the last 18 months. 8 of them shared the same characteristics. Numbers instead of names. Targeted inspections, isolation from peers, early dismissal. None of them had filed formal complaints that survived review. Not because nothing happened, because nothing stuck. In the barracks, recruits whispered among themselves. Stories surfaced, quietly at first, then with urgency. He did that to Martinez. I remember how he treated Jackson. He always called her that one. For the first time, people were saying names out loud. Diana was interviewed last. She sat alone in a small office, bandage still on her lip, hands folded in her lap. Why didn't you speak sooner? One officer asked gently. Because I wanted proof, Diana replied, and because I wanted him to show who he was, without knowing who I was. Outside that office, something irreversible had begun. What Holloway thought was discipline had been documented as maltreatment. What he thought was toughness had become discrimination. And what he thought was silence had turned into testimony. The system had protected Holloway for years. But now, the system was looking at itself, and it didn't like what it saw. The tribunal convened 6 weeks later. No drill yard, no shouting, no place to hide behind rank or volume. Just a long room, panelled in dull wood, flags standing at attention in the corners, and a raised bench where the military judges sat in silence. Staff Sergeant Derek Holloway stood alone. His uniform no longer carried authority. The drill sergeant badge was gone. The confidence that once filled his posture had collapsed into something smaller, brittle. He looked older than his years, like time had finally caught up all at once. "Proceed," the presiding judge said. Colonel Richardson stood and began calmly. "This tribunal concerns allegations of cruelty, maltreatment, discriminatory conduct, and assault under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. No theatrics, no emotion, just facts." She called the first witness, then another, and another. One by one, former recruits stood and spoke. Some voices shook, some were flat with restraint, all of them told the same story. "I was called by my number. He said I didn't belong. I stopped trying because I thought it was me." Training footage played on a large screen, clips slowed, paused, replayed, Holloway calling names clearly, deliberately, then skipping over Diana, skipping over others. The room watched as patterns formed in real time. Colonel Morrison stood next. "Let the record reflect," he said, "that over an 18-month period, 23 informal complaints referencing Staff Sergeant Holloway were logged." A murmur spread. "None resulted in disciplinary action," he continued. "All were dismissed, deferred, or lost." He held up a stack of files. "These are the recruits who washed out under his supervision." One by one, names were read aloud. Not numbers, names. Some had never been spoken in that building before. When Diana was called, she stood. She didn't dramatize. She didn't accuse. She told the truth. "I wasn't targeted because I performed poorly," she said. "I was targeted because he thought I was powerless." She paused. He was wrong. Holloway stared at the floor. When asked if he had anything to say in his defense, he stood slowly. "I was training them," he said hoarsely. "This is how it's always been done." The judge leaned forward. "And do you believe," she asked, "that striking a recruit is training?" Holloway didn't answer, because there was no answer left. The evidence was overwhelming. But the verdict wasn't just about guilt. The room was silent when the judges returned. No papers rustled, no one shifted in their seat. Even Holloway seemed to stop breathing. The presiding judge stood. "Staff Sergeant Derek J. Holloway," she began, her voice steady. "This tribunal finds you guilty on all charges." The word landed heavy. Guilty. Article 93, cruelty and maltreatment. Guilty. Article 128, assault. Guilty. Article 134, conduct unbecoming. Guilty. Each count was read slowly, deliberately, as if the court wanted the weight of every syllable to settle in. Holloway's shoulders sagged. 15 years of service. 3 deployments. Commendations that once meant something. None of it mattered now. The judge continued. "In determining sentence, this court considered aggravating factors, including a documented pattern of discriminatory conduct and deliberate dehumanization of subordinates." Deliberate. That word hurt more than the rest. "Sentence," she said. "Reduction in rank to Private E1, forfeiture of all pay and allowances for 12 months, confinement for 180 days, and dishonorable discharge upon completion." The gavel struck. It was over. Holloway didn't collapse. He didn't shout. He didn't plead. He just stood there, hollowed out, as MPs stepped forward to escort him away. As he passed the gallery, his eyes found Diana. She was seated in uniform, composed, her name visible on her chest. "Foster," he whispered. It was the first time he had ever said it without being forced. "I'm sorry." Diana met his gaze. "That matters," she said quietly. "But it doesn't undo what you chose to do." He nodded once. Then he was gone. Outside the courtroom, the world kept moving. Recruits trained, orders were given, flags were raised and lowered. But something fundamental had shifted, because for the first time, the system had listened. Holloway's career was over, but Diana's story was only just beginning. The army didn't call it a scandal, it called it a review. But everyone at Fort Marshall knew better. Within days of the verdict, directives came down from levels most recruits would never see. Training protocols were paused. Drill sergeants were pulled into briefings that ran late into the night. New oversight measures appeared, quietly at first, then with unmistakable force. What Holloway had done was no longer being treated as an isolated failure. It was being examined as a system that had allowed it. A new requirement was issued across multiple training centers. Every drill instructor would formally acknowledge, in writing, the names of every recruit under their supervision. Not numbers. Not positions. Names. It seemed small, almost symbolic, until people realized what it meant. Names create records. Records create accountability. Colonel Vance called it the first line of dignity. Among the recruits, the change was immediate. Conversations shifted. People sat where they wanted at meals. Eye contact returned. Laughter, quiet, cautious at first, found its way back into the barracks. And Diana? She returned to training the very next morning. Same uniform, same schedule, same expectations, no special treatment. That was exactly how she wanted it. Some recruits didn't know how to act around her now. They stumbled over words, unsure whether to apologize or pretend nothing had happened. Diana made it easy. She treated them exactly the same as before. One evening, Tommy Reeves finally worked up the nerve to speak. "I should have sat with you," he said quietly. "I was scared." Diana nodded. "I know." "I testified," he added. "Everything I saw." "I know that too." He hesitated. "Does that help?" Diana considered the question carefully. "It doesn't change the past," she said, "but it changes the next person's future." That night, Diana wrote one line in her journal. "Being seen isn't power. Making others visible is." Diana didn't want revenge. She wanted reform. Graduation day arrived quietly. No fanfare, no dramatic speeches, just rows of recruits standing taller than they ever had before. Uniforms pressed, eyes forward, transformed by weeks of exhaustion, discipline, and survival. Diana stood among them, not in front, not set apart, exactly where she belonged. When her name was called, it rang clear across the parade ground. "Foster Diana Grace!" She stepped forward, accepted her certificate, and returned to formation without looking left or right. No applause broke protocol, but something passed between the recruits. Recognition, respect, understanding. Later that afternoon, a Black Hawk helicopter touched down beyond the fence. General Raymond Foster stepped out before the rotors fully slowed. 4 stars caught the light on his collar, but he didn't look like a general in that moment. He looked like a father. Diana met him near the administrative building, a small bandage still visible beneath her collar. He pulled her into a brief embrace. "He never asked your name," he said quietly. "No," Diana replied. "He didn't." "You could have stopped it," he said. "And then nothing would have changed," she answered. Her father studied her for a long moment, pride softening his expression. "You understand leadership better than most officers twice your age," he said. "I learned it by watching who didn't have it," Diana replied. In the months that followed, changes rippled outward. Complaints once buried were reviewed. Instructors once untouchable were suddenly accountable. Recruits reported feeling something unfamiliar. Safe. Years later, when Diana stood in front of her own unit as an officer, she began every morning the same way. She called roll, and she learned every name, because she remembered what it felt like to be reduced to a number, and she made sure no one under her command ever was. Long after the uniforms change and the ranks fade, what remains is how people are remembered. Not by how loudly they commanded, but by whether they saw the people standing in front of them. Staff Sergeant Holloway believed power meant never having to learn a name. Diana Foster proved the opposite, that true authority begins with recognition, with dignity, with the simple human act of saying, "I see you," History doesn't remember those who reduce others to numbers. It remembers those who refuse to let that happen. And sometimes, justice doesn't arrive with raised voices or clenched fists. Sometimes, it arrives quietly, carried by a name finally spoken out loud. Before you move on, ask yourself this. Do you know the names of the people you see every day, but don't really see? Because power isn't proven by how we treat the important. It's revealed by how we treat the invisible. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that names matter. Because everyone deserves to be called by theirs, and if this story reminded you that the past never truly disappears, stay with us for the next one. Because sometimes, history doesn't come back as a name on a roster. It comes back as a necklace no one expected to see again. In our next story, billionaire grandma froze at a black girl's necklace, then she burst into tears and hugged her. One quiet question opens a door to a lost heir, a buried secret, and a reunion no one saw coming. Don't click away. The next story is already waiting.